Okay, we're probably ready to start now. So thank you for joining us. This is the first meeting that we are hosting as Red Spark as part of our seminar series, anti-imperialist seminar series. So this is the anti-imperialist solidarity campaigns in Australia, Indonesia, Vietnam, Timor-Leste, and Palestine today. So after this one, we have 3 more meetings. The next is going to be Viva Cuba and Venezuela and the blockades. Then we're going to have China's challenge to the US stranglehold, and then capitalism and war. And we basically wanted to put on this series of lectures to create a forum in which we can discuss what we're seeing in the world today with regards to the destruction and terror and brutality that's caused by capitalism, but then also to talk about the importance of internationalist solidarity and collective organizing to oppose those things. So before I introduce the speaker, you may have noticed that this lecture is in memorial of John Percy. So before we start, I'm just going to hand over to Max, to Sam even, who's going to tell us who John Percy is.
Okay. We assume that most people, or not everybody's heard of John Percy, and probably be wondering, why have a memorial lecture for him, and that's tied to the fact that probably most people haven't heard of the Democratic Socialist Party, which John Percy led, which is sort of a strange thing because that was actually the dominant socialist organisation in Australia from around 1991 until the mid-2000s, so for 15 years. It was one of the major socialist currents in Australia, which is necessary for us to know about if we are to know the history of the struggle in this country. John Percy was the National Secretary in that period, and one of the founders of the currents, which started in the late 1960s. And I think we can safely say he was one of the outstanding socialist post-war leaders in Australia. 2 of the 3 historical examples of international solidarity that Max will talk about in his presentation, the Democratic Socialist Party played key leadership roles within them. And John himself and his brother Jim Percy was a leader of the anti-Vietnam War movement in Sydney. He was also for a time a party branch organiser in Melbourne here. And when the Democratic Socialist Party did what was called a turn to industry in the late 1970s and early 1980s, John moved to Melbourne and got a job on the trams as his contribution, I guess, to the organisation of basic industry. A lot more could be said about John's international solidarity work. In the 1990s, he, together with Max Lane and others, were involved in the development of the Democratic Socialist Party's, international network of Marxist parties in Asia, of parties that work together from many countries, including Indonesia, East Timor, India, Pakistan, Mauritius, the Philippines, and elsewhere. So I guess that, in a way, that party-to-party solidarity was the flip side of the international solidarity campaigning or organising of mass campaigning that is going to be the focus of Max's talk. John was extremely tenacious, almost 50 years. He was involved in the political movement as a socialist leader until he died in 2015. One of the rare 1960s radical youth who never shifted to the right. He stayed, a radical youth in a sense throughout his life. We also published about John on our website, on Red Spark. I made the argument in that article the crucial importance of the 1960s and 70s generation of radicals today. Because today we have the beginnings or perhaps the potential for a new radicalisation, but there's also a discontinuity. There's a discontinuity with the past organising, and there's a pervasive lack, I would say, of historical consciousness, certainly of the struggles that existed in this country. But that's the purpose of a revolutionary party such as John built, is to bring historical lessons and to bring continuity, so that there's no need to learn everything from scratch or from the beginning with basically every new generation or every new struggle. But now we have discontinuity and we do need to rebuild. That's a fact of the situation we're in. We have to study the past in a serious way. And this also means the older generation, those besides John, who also never went to the right, have a role to play today as well. Not only the generation from the 60s and 70s, but also the 80s and 90s and so on, who have experiences that they can bring to bear. That will be very strategic in our ongoing project of rebuilding. And if we can get any more help from the older comrades, that will be very useful. This, I think, is what John would have said. His whole life was, I guess, in a way devoted to organising people into struggle. So I think with that, we can hear the lecture and remember some of what's John's legacy. John Percy, presente.
Thank you, Sam. The way the meeting is going to run is that Max is going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 40 minutes for discussion for any questions or contributions or critiques that anyone wants to raise. So before we start, I'm just going to give a short introduction to Max. So Max Lane is a socialist activist and writer known for his expertise on Southeast Asian politics, and in particular on Indonesia. He's been active in political solidarity with liberation movements in Indonesia, Timor-Leste and the Philippines since the 1970s. He wrote on Southeast Asian affairs for Green Left Weekly from 1990 to 2007, and his works include Unfinished Nation, Indonesia Before and After Suharto, published in 2008, and Indonesia Out of Exile, published in 2024. In 2024, he was awarded the Timor-Leste Medal of Honor for his solidarity work with Indonesia and Timor-Leste, and he is a member of Red Spark. So, over to you, Max.
Thank you, Ria. Well, first, thank you everybody for coming. And also, for me, it's a rather moving thing to be able to speak on the first memorial lecture for John Percy. John Percy was probably one of my closest comrades from 1990 when I moved from Canberra to Sydney until he passed away 10 years ago. We were comrades on the national executive of the Democratic Socialist Party, and we both played a role in establishing the international journal Links, which brought together the network of parties that Sam mentioned before. That was up until 2007, when there was a conflict inside the party, and it broke into two, and John and myself and Sam and several others have been for some time trying to start things anew. And it's also very symbolic in a sense, because in terms to talk about the international solidarity campaigns in Australia over the years, because as regards the campaign against the Vietnam War, I think it's legitimate for John, as he did on one or two occasions, because he was a very modest person, claimed to be the first person arrested in Australia because of participating in an anti-Vietnam War demonstration, when he and another New South Wales left-winger, Bob Gould, were arrested after a sit-down protest in a major intersection in Canberra back in, I forget the exact year, 1969 or 1968 or something like that. So yes, I've got 45 minutes to cover 80 years, so that's 2 minutes per year. So I'm going to have to try and summarise things down to some key points. And I thought I'd start off with, the slide's not working. Why is it not working? It was working a minute ago. I use this one, is it? Okay. So first, just a comment. I'm going to be going over 80 years of history, but the whole point, of course, is by reviewing that history to get to understand how political movements, especially international solidarity campaigns, evolve, and by reviewing that history, try to equip us to understand better what's happening now. And of course, at the moment, there's the big campaign in solidarity with the Palestinian people in their struggle for freedom. But I think our starting point is this question of, well, actually, where is Australia located sort of politically and internationally? And I think one of the first campaign I'm going to talk about is a campaign for the release of Indonesian political prisoners imprisoned in Australia. Now, you might ask, how is it possible that Indonesian political prisoners can be in jail in Australia back in 1942? And I think a little bit of the background to this sort of hammers home to us just where Australia is located politically in the global scene. In 1942, the Japanese invaded the Dutch East Indies, a Dutch colony. And a telegram was sent from the Governor General of the Netherlands East Indies to the Prime Minister of Australia, it's the Labor government at the time, saying, listen, we've got a few hundred people we put in a concentration camp, or they didn't use that word, put in a prison camp in West Papua. We're afraid if the Japanese get there, or when the Japanese get there, all these nationalists and communists will be released. We don't want that to happen. Can we put them in a jail in Australia? And of course, the Australian government just said, yeah, of course, bring them down. So they'll put in, some went in the planes, but most were brought in a boat all the way down to Sydney, Australia, and were shipped off to a prison camp in North New South Wales, Cowra. There's some photos of the Dutch soldiers also came down there on the bottom picture, and the one on the right, just a photo of some of the prisoners who were put in Cowra in New South Wales. The prison camp in Cowra was quite big. Half of it was filled with the Indonesians who came down from the prison camp in West Papua, and the other half were Japanese people, Japanese who'd been interned there. 1,200 internees, many of them were very sick from malaria, from West Papua and other illnesses. 9 died in their first 3 months in Papua. But I think that one of the key things is just to understand that, in Australia at the time, I think across the whole spectrum of society, there was no questioning of the Dutch having a colony. Colonies were just accepted as part of the natural order. And actually in Australia, I put these news clippings up, which are from the very early 20th century, 1910, 1923, 1938, in the 20s and 30s. But if you even look earlier, you find the same thing, that already in Australia, amongst the Australian capitalist class, there was an enormous interest in the market and resources of the Netherlands East Indies. If you go back and look at the newspapers from 1900 until 1940, there's enormous, 90% of all reports about the Dutch East Indies are about the economic potential of trade. But of course, when there was an uprising, communist rebellion against the Dutch in 1926, it also got reported. This article up there, Soviet influence at work. It's actually quite a long article in the Launceston newspaper from Tasmania. Actually, these reports they weren't sourced. They weren't written by Australians. They were sourced from international news sources, and you find them in all of the regional newspapers: Mackay, Launceston, Adelaide, Perth. They all reproduced the same articles, but it was trade possibilities that was the main thing. And Australia had a consul general in Batavia, whose main task was, of course, to facilitate trade and also help the Australians who often went up there to work and got in trouble for one reason or other. So the first actual struggle I want to talk about is the struggle to free those prisoners in Cowra. It's quite a interesting little story, and be good for the basis of a short story actually, because the prisoners come down on a boat, they shift onto a train to take them to Cowra, and at Liverpool railway station, somehow one of these Indonesian prisoners was able to get a sheet of paper and write a message: "We are political prisoners being taken to Cowra," wrap it around something, a stone I think, and throw it out the carriage window, and a worker in the railway station picked it up, who happened to be active in the railways union, and took it to his union, which also had many members of the Communist Party in it. And you soon saw a coalition develop demanding the release of these prisoners from Cowra. The Communist Party played a big role. The main book, if you want to read a book about this, you should read Black Armada by Rupert Lockwood, who was a Communist Party journalist, a young journalist at the time. So the trade unions played a role in campaigning. Also, civil rights groups. There was a Civil Rights League, which had a very anti-fascist. You can see Laura Gap there, one of the Australians who played a leading role in the Civil Rights League at that time. Also, Anglican Church. And the campaign lasted several months, and the prisoners, the Labor government, finally released all the prisoners in November 1943. So they arrived in early 1943, and they were released in November 1943 as a result of the protests, which are public meetings, street demonstrations, and so on. In fact, you can see here a report: "Wild Fight in City." Some historians claim that a University of Sydney student demonstration against the Dutch and in solidarity with the Indonesians was the first student demonstration in Australia to be broken up by police. They're mainly from students from the Sydney University Labour Club. So that campaign went on for several months. A short campaign, really, if you think about it. And resulted in the release of the prisoners. And then you have this, what I think is quite a fascinating, if not amazing, situation. Australia in 1942 was solidly and completely a white Australia country. The white Australia immigration laws were still on the books. So according to Australian law, Australia was only for white people. Of course, it was still a few decades before the referendum to count Aboriginals as human beings and residents took place. So suddenly you had 300 mostly Indonesian communists loose in white Australia. And what was the first thing they did? They set up independence committees to campaign for independence for Indonesia. And they did it. The committees they set up did not comprise only Indonesians, but they comprised Australian, what we would call today, solidarity activists. I don't know that the term was used back then, but friends of Indonesia who joined in various committees around the country to work with the Indonesians, demanding, in support of independence for Indonesia. And then, of course, in 1945, the war broke out in Indonesia between Indonesians and the Dutch, who announced very quickly that they wanted to retake the colony for Holland. But of course, you have to imagine the situation that the Dutch when Japan invaded the Netherlands East Indies, the Dutch ran away basically. Some who weren't able to get out of the country were put in camps across the Netherlands East Indies, which, by the way, Japan started to recognise the name Indonesia. Some escaped. This is another part of the, getting an idea where Australia is located. Not only were the political prisoners brought from West Papua and put in prison in Australia until the campaign succeeded in getting them released, but the Dutch Governor General said, "Oh, by the way, we have to escape from the Netherlands East Indies. For the time being, can the capital of the Netherlands East Indies be in Melbourne?" Of course, Australian government said yes. So the Governor-General was flown out on Qantas airplanes from the town of Cilacap on the south coast of Java, and they were brought down to Australia, and the headquarters of the Netherlands East Indies for the whole course of World War II was based in Melbourne. Sometimes for a time also in Brisbane. So these Indonesians who set up the Indonesian independence committees then campaigned for independence against the Dutch with the Governor-General in Australia, the Dutch Governor-General in Australia, of course, campaigning against them and trying to harass them, even to the extent, during World War II, many men who were not being sent to war were often asked to participate in labour brigades across the country to fix up this or fix up that. And a lot of the Indonesians got in, were either volunteered or asked to join or recruited into labour brigades. And then the Dutch insisted any Indonesian working in one of these labour brigades around Australia must only be paid what they would be paid back in the colony, way, way below the payment that was made to Australians. That kind of behaviour actually started to alienate Australian trade unionists, but also even Australian public servants who kept being harassed that they were paying the Indonesians in the labour grades too much. But anyway, across the whole of white Australia, in almost every city and some smaller towns as well, Indonesian independence committees were set up. This campaign really came to a head when the Dutch tried to go back to Indonesia, because you have to remember World War II, the Netherlands East Indies had been occupied by the Nazis, so there took them some time to get a military force together. They got part of their military force to go back to in their eyes, East Indies, was made up of Nazi collaborators in the Netherlands who were given amnesty if they were volunteered to go and fight to get back Indonesia. But Netherlands is a long way, and they had to come and either mainly refuel or have repairs done for them in Australia first before going on to Java or other islands in the Indonesian archipelago. So there were Indonesian ships, or not Dutch ships, as I say, in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and also Perth, Fremantle. And the Indonesians went to the Waterside Workers Union and other unions and said, well, can you put a black ban on all Dutch ships? And the unions agreed. Of course, the Communist Party at that time was also influential in the Waterside Workers Union and some other unions. And so across all of the trade unions, I think almost 100 trade unions which were then active on the waterfront or close to the waterfront put a black ban on Dutch ships. And that actually stopped 559 major vessels and 1,000 landing craft. I'm not sure exactly what they were. They were kept in Australian ports for months and months, which means the Dutch were not able to launch the military offensive they was on time. It was delayed. Of course, the Conservative side of this, the Labor Party had an ambiguous kind of attitude to this, sometimes supporting it, sometimes vacillating in their support for the black ban. Meanwhile, the Liberal Party at that time, headed by Robert Menzies, really campaigned against this, saying, as I put up there, that this is an attempt by communists in the Waterside Workers' Federation to interview in the domestic affairs of another country. So no, just oblivious to the fact that it's a colony with the people struggling for their independence. There is also, one would have to say, not simply ambiguity on the part of the Labour Party, but also, if you watch, there's a great film called Indonesia Calling, produced by the Waterside Workers' Federation back in 1946, directed by one of the Netherlands' great documentary makers, Joris Evans, who, as a result of making that film, was unable to return to the Netherlands for decades because he was labelled a traitor. But right at the beginning of that film, the first scene you see is all the Indonesians getting on a ship to go back to Indonesia. In the film, it doesn't say why they were getting on the ship at that time. Of course, most of them wanted to go back to Indonesia and join the fight, but the actual reason why they were leaving at that time was the Australian Labor Party Minister of Immigration, Arthur Caldwell, made the statement, "We have a white Australia policy, full stop. There is now territory on Java that is controlled by Indonesian forces. So there's no excuse for the Indonesians in Australia to remain here." So they were basically deported and went and had to go back to Indonesia. But I recommend this book, Brakamad, if you're interested in what happened during that struggle. So that ship's black. It was all over the newspapers, big news. It was, I think, even up till today, in terms of the number of trade unions involved, it's the biggest number of trade unions involved in any industrial action in Australian history up until now. Of course, facilitated by the fact that back then the trade unions hadn't all amalgamated into several big ones. So that's the first one, that the first international solidarity campaign I want to talk about. From 1950 to up until the late 60s, there were other international issues that the left in Australia paid attention to. One was the emergence in Malaya, when the Communist Party of Malaya launched a guerrilla struggle against the British. Of course, there was the Korean War as well, but it was really Vietnam after 1965 that started to mobilise people in Australia again. Now, Australia started sending troops to Vietnam in 1962 and kept going until 1972. In 1965, there was an escalation. First, it sent so-called training troops. There were then ground forces were sent in 65, and the small protests began, including the one where Comrade John got and Bob Gould got arrested. It's an interesting pattern because it's a bit similar, perhaps, what we've seen with Palestine. A lot of small demonstrations first, involving and I think one of the most interesting things about this is the kind of coalition of forces that developed that really provided the energy and organisation for the movement to grow. And it was 65 to 70 where the movement grew the fastest. At that time, a left wing of the Labour Party was involved in mobilisations against the Vietnam War. The Communist Party, which in this period was still quite a hefty force. The Socialist Workers' Party, which was the precursor to the Democratic Socialist Party, were also involved, but a much smaller force at that time, having only just been formed, although their youth activists played quite a prominent role. And the CPA in the upper left had a very strong influence in the trade unions, and so trade unions also mobilised in the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations, especially as the momentum created. The Socialist Workers' Party had a youth organisation, changed its names a couple of times, but eventually known as Resistance. So it was involved in organising students to participate, and also the Communist Party as well. And there were lots of civil society groups too, like Save Our Sons, Youth Against Conscription, and of course church elements were also involved. Then in 1969, the Victorian Moratorium Campaign was established, sort of inspired by a similar organisation in the United States. So for the first time, we had a national coalition of not all, but most of the forces that were calling for troops out of Vietnam, Australian troops out of Vietnam, and against the US's involvement in Vietnam as well. And this peaked in 1970 with 200 demonstration nationally, 200,000 people. Because you have to put that in context, the population of Australia back then was 12 million. So today it'd be what, 400,000 or between 400 and 500,000. These were, in the context, very, very big. I remember I was just in first year university and still not very involved in politics at that point. And I remember joining the march from University of Sydney on Broadway, and I'll tell you, there was not 1 inch of space from University of Sydney right to Town Hall. Both sides of the street was a non-broken line of cops, just blue. And at the end at Town Hall, there was quite a bit of nasty violence. The cops and the demonstrators at the front of the line. But it was a huge demonstration. It really turned the tide. You started to see the Liberal government at the time become more vacillating on their commitment to Vietnam, and some of the even Liberal Party politicians started to announce that they'd draw down on troops. There were Vietnam moratorium mobilisations that continued, that occurred a few more times, not quite as large as this, but still large enough to apply the pressure. And of course, it meant that the Labor Party, which took up the position of troops out from Vietnam, was able to take advantage of that. And in the Labor Party, when they won the election in 1972, the first thing they did was announce the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam. So that Australia withdrew its troops from Vietnam before America. I think just some key features to note. First of all, it was very broad. Civil liberties, churches, the organised left, the Labor Party, trade unions, of course, providing a kind of the critical mass for numbers in the demonstrations, and also the fact that it was a period when you had Labor Party members of Parliament actually being spokespersons for this movement. Jim Cairns is one of the well-known Vietnam War campaigners that was a Labor Party minister and actually then became the treasurer in the first one of the Whitlam cabinets. I think also there was quite a rich ideological life if you're involved in the internal struggles. Although initially everyone had the demand of out now, troops out now, later on there was a debates which everyone sort of had to engage in and get their political brain cells thinking is, should it be out, should the slogan be out now, or will the slogan negotiate now actually get a bigger support from the community? So that was quite an intense debate at times between different elements on the centre left and far left in Australia. And of course we're talking about the 60s. So all this was further enriched by the rise of the women's liberation movement, gay rights movement, and of course everybody in Australia in the 50s and 60s, in the early 70s, everybody, so I'm a product of this myself, everybody followed the United States. And it was a long time before Australian media, television media in particular, had the capacity to produce a lot of content itself. So we were all following the United States. And the civil rights movement in the US was very big news in this period. as was the anti-Vietnam War movement. So that also framed a lot of what was happening at the time. But of course, 1975, the Americans also were defeated and were forced to withdraw. So that whole momentum for the anti-war movement also just very quickly demobilized, which of course is a natural thing. If there's a mass movement campaigning for a specific demand and that demand is won, then the basis for it to continue on the same scale and with the same momentum disappears. And of course in 1975, so you all here remember, that the Whitlam government was dismissed, and the right wing of the Labor Party started to increase its dominance in the Australian Labor Party. First with Bill Hayden as leader, and then later on Bob Hawke and Paul Keating. And we had after 1980, 1983, an extended period of demobilisation. And it took some time for something else to, a new larger movement to emerge. Of course, there was another massive incident, international incident, that provoked an international solidarity response from elements in Australian society, and that was the Indonesian invasion of East Timor, which took place in 1975. And there were many protests about that. But I think in the between 1975 and 1991, that campaign didn't really pick up momentum. Part of it was because the movement in Timor itself, which became a military conflict, there was decreasing amounts of information coming out, and there was really the leaders who had been able to escape from East Timor that were doing the campaign work outside, around the world. But on the left of the ALP and the Communist Party, there were elements, and therefore also in the trade unions, there were elements that were campaigning against the Indonesian invasion of East Timor and in solidarity with the movement for national liberation in East Timor. That went through a particularly demoralising moment. And I remember this extremely clearly because I was there at the time, when the Australian Labor Party held its national conference in a big hotel, luxury hotel in Canberra, and José Ramos Horta, the current president of East Timor, was a young guy then. He was campaigning. He was at the Labor Party conference, and we had meetings every morning during each day of the Labor Party comrades activists who were pro-East Timor with Horta. I was in the Socialist Workers' Party then, and also sort of in the Labor Party at the same time. We had a meeting every morning, and it was just, for Horta himself, it was clearly very demoralising, because as each day went, the left members would say, in order to win a concession on this policy, we've had to retreat on East Timor. In order to win a concession on this policy, we've had to retreat on East Timor. By the end of the conference, the Labor Party's official support for independence for East Timor had vanished from its platform. There were huge demonstrations outside of by Timorese refugees who'd fled in Timor-Leste in the previous several years. Very big demonstrations. Timorese came mainly from Sydney, hundreds of them. I remember that was big, basically because I was there watching it, but also because I had to cook a curry for 300 Timorese sleeping on mats in one of the gymnasiums school there. But it was a very exciting demonstration, but demoralising to see the decision that came out of it. The Labor Party ditched East Timor, basically. During the 80s, there were other demonstrations against international solidarity campaigns in Australia on things happening in New Caledonia. Also the Philippines, the anti-Marcos movement in the Philippines was peaking in the mid-1980s. And there are also regular annual demonstrations which had a sort of international solidarity aspect to it against for nuclear disarmament. But many of those demonstrations also raised issues they would have on the demands of the leaflets or solidarity with third world struggles. But during the 80s, nothing of a mass scale or with momentum really began. But I think this changed after the 1991 massacre in Dili. I think that sparked a new momentum of campaigning around Timor-Leste. But it faced, on the one hand, one of the reasons that this particular incident, Dili massacre, was able to spark a movement, momentum, was that a bit like Vietnam and perhaps a bit like Gaza today, although Gaza is just so everyday and so vivid, but there was footage, video footage from the demonstration that was attacked by the Indonesian military in 1991. There was a cameraman, Max Stahl, and there were other foreign journalists in Dili that were able to get footage out of the demonstration. And then John Pilger, the Australian filmmaker and documentary, made a documentary, Death of a Nation, Timor Betrayed, and used some of the clips from the demonstration. So these are just three examples I took from the film. But those scenes were seen by everybody in Australia. Everybody, in fact, everybody around the world. Only one group of people never saw them. It was never seen in Indonesia. Of course, there was no internet then, so if it wasn't on TV, you just didn't see it. So Indonesians never saw any of the graphic pictures that came out of East Timor. Of course, there was so the scale of the massacre, the inhumanity of it, and the Jakarta regime's lying denial of it helped provoke a community response, a public response. But of course, as the movement developed, it faced different objective conditions than at the time of Vietnam or the time of Indonesia. There was to all intents and purposes, first of all, the ALP was supporting the Indonesian occupation of East Timor, mainly so that it could sign an agreement over oil and gas in the Timor Sea. The ALP left by 1991. The organised socialist left in the ALP had just about totally disintegrated, although there were individuals around, but you never saw, they weren't organised or like they were in the 70s or 60s or 50s. So that was gone. Trade unions membership had shrunk. Now it's what, 10, 11, 12% in Australia today. In the 60s and 70s it was 70 or 80% union coverage. So that kind of critical mass of left-wing or social democratic oriented ordinary people organised on a collective basis didn't exist. By 1991, a majority of the Communist Party of Australia had held a Congress and liquidated itself. There was a minority who went on to form the Socialist Party and later on changed their name to the Communist Party of Australia. So the Communist Party of Australia that exists in Australia today has its origins in the minority that refused to liquidate. So you had this big party that existed before wasn't around anymore, and some of the key people most committed to the East Timorese cause in the Communist Party. We know one outstanding activist, Dennis Srini. He was already aging, and by 1995, he'd passed away. And also I didn't mention this earlier, but in the 60s and 70s, there were aid agencies that had a kind of course they are still charities in their basic characteristic, but their membership had a sort of progressive orientation, and they received no money from the government. So big aid organisations like the Freedom from Hunger campaign or Community Aid Abroad, they gathered all their money from the community, donations, big events and so on. And Community Aid Abroad in particular, and there was a couple of others like this, had a quite sort of centre-left, the rich world is exploiting the poor world kind of orientation, and their membership would also get involved in all these, international solidarity campaign. But by 1991, most of them had also been totally co-opted. Once the Labor Party came into power, they said, well, no need to raise money from the community, we'll give it to you. So by 1990, just about 100% of these organisations had become dependent on the government. So the social democratic popular sector that used to exist, it was always, was never the dominant force in Australian politics, but it existed as a significant force. It had become demobilised. So the Timor Solidarity of Timor campaign had to develop in quite difficult circumstances. One of the things that helped, as I said, was John Pilger's Death of a Nation documentary, which came out soon after the massacre and really galvanised opinion, helped galvanise opinion around the country. But there were other, I listed the negative forces, the negative change of conditions. There were positive, there were new factors as well. One was the existence in most Australian capital cities of a very significant Timorese refugee community, thousands. And they were politically, most of them, almost all of them were politically organised, either in Fretilin, the main centre-left revolutionary front for the liberation of East Timor that was leading the movement against Portuguese colonialism back in 1975. The more conservative UDT was actually also very active in the campaigns in the 1990s, and there were other smaller East Timorese groups as well. So there was a critical mass there. The first demonstrations after the Timorese massacre in 1991 were mostly Timorese, with a few Australians. Then they were joined by Malaysian students, organised in the National Organisation of Student Collectives. There were Malaysian students sort of influenced by third world politics or Maoism who threw themselves into the campaign, especially in Sydney where they were based, working with Fretilin to organise street demonstrations, some of which were quite big. And then around the country there were East Timor, Australia East Timor Association or Committee for Independent East Timor and several others like that who in the 1990s were no longer big. They played a very significant, important role in the 70s, early 80s. But at this time, they still were there and able to do activity, but they weren't large organisations. But then in some cities, in response to the Dili massacre, you had spontaneous new committees emerging. I used to attend the one in Sydney. It was held in Leichhardt Town Hall up in Sydney. You would get 50 to 100 people at an organising meeting to organise the demonstrations. And they were very broad. They would have Labor Party members, although the Labor Party members were there as more as individuals, people from the far left groups, a very mixed range of people who, for one reason or another, had developed some personal link with the Timorese community. Party-wise, it was the Democratic Socialist Party, where I was a member, Resistance, and a committee that we initiated the formation of, Action in Solidarity with Indonesia and East Timor, that were the main sort of organised left group there, and there'd be 4 or 5 of us in a meeting of 50 or 60 people wanting to organise things. So it was in the actual composition of these spontaneous committees varied from city to city. So the different balance of forces in some cities, the smaller 1975 groups are more influential. In other cities, it might be people from trade unions. It varied from city to city. But in all cities, the Timorese community played a very important anchoring role. So this is just some of the materials that Green Left Weekly, where I worked and I was editor for a while, we had every second week or third week covers like this, or back covers like this. The one on the corner is a publication, a pamphlet was published by the National Union of Students at that time. One big important event was this one here, when in Sydney we were able to organise with the collaboration of Portuguese University the first time that Timorese resistance leaders and Indonesian opposition leaders were able to meet and discuss things. And we had many here, like the ASEAN one, National Day of Action. There were several of those every year. So these ones deal with the actions and propaganda from the DSP and ASEAN, but actually there was a myriad of different small groups, even individuals, playing a significant role in stirring things up, building interest in Australia. Some of the individuals did quite remarkable things, sneak into East Timor and bring out documents, and this then helped generate publicity. It's a very vibrant movement overall for that period. There was no equivalent to the Vietnam Moratorium campaign, so there was no national East Timor Solidarity Committee. But Fretilin and UDT, because they existed in all cities, gave a certain, meant there was a certain element of national coordination that took place. The DSP also had branches in every city, so that also helped. The East Timor groups, the ones that emerged in the 1970s, tended to be more separate and state-based, but they also had national gatherings to discuss strategy and tactics, and the whole thing was given a particular national focus, because on the day of the Dili massacre every November, there will be demonstrations with similar demands, similar slogans in every city in Australia. And preparation would start for that for 6 months beforehand, with committees, which were also quite broad in their composition, depending from state to state. So there wasn't a Vietnam Moratorium Committee, but there was still a strong national framework, both through the national days and the existence of Fretilin, and to a certain extent the presence of the DSP in the whole, in every city as well. In 1999, after Suharto was pushed from power through the protest movement, my own personal view is that the Indonesian protest movement ability to force Suharto from power was the single most important event that accelerated independence for East Timor. There was a referendum, but it was very clear before the referendum on whether Timorese wanted their own country or not. It was very clear that the military in Indonesia would react very savagely if they lost the referendum. One of the extraordinary figures that I mentioned, individual figures, was a guy called Andrew McNaughton, who was able to go to Timor and somehow get out of it safely again with documents which revealed the scorched earth policy that some in the military were planning if they lost the referendum. And so that's what happened. The Timorese voted overwhelmingly for independence, and the Indonesian military, in conjunction with militia, East Timorese militia under their control, unleashed massive violence. That sparked, because you have to imagine here, from 1991 through to 1999, this activity had been constant. Timorese protesting by Timorese and by the Solidarity Movement was constant. There were big conferences, there was TV coverage, there was newspaper coverage. So everybody knew what was happening in East Timor. Polls showed that between 60 and 70% of the Australian people, wanted Australia to do more. That's a bit of an echo of sentiment you get in Australia now. But the Labor government and then the Howard government resisted that all along. When the violence was unleashed, given that the sentiment was there in support of East Timor, the protest movement really, within 10 days, the number of demonstrations, including trade union boycotts, but street demonstrations really accelerated. the group I was in had, because everyone knew and we could see that the violence was likely to happen. Even before the violence unleashed, we'd already started publicity for a big rally and getting support for a big rally. We can see the list of organisations at the bottom. And that took place on September 11. That was about 30,000 people at that. There were demonstrations in Melbourne. The one in Melbourne might have even been bigger. It was sort of facilitated directly by some trade unions. There were demonstrations all around the country. There were even bigger, huge, massive demonstrations in Portugal against this as well. I think my reading of the situation was that the Australian state, the Howard government, could see that if there wasn't a breakthrough in Timor-Leste itself, that these demonstrations would escalate to the very angry demonstrations as well. These demonstrations would escalate very quickly and would, threaten the legitimacy of the Australian government itself. Enormous pressure, enormous appeals were made to President Clinton in the US to pressure the Indonesian government to withdraw the Indonesian troops. And finally, President Habibie, who'd replaced President Suharto, announced that Indonesian troops would withdraw and that they had no objection to an international force, which is mainly an Australian force, going into East Timor. I was in touch on the phone during this period with one of President Habibie's advisors on a daily basis, and I think the dynamic here was that President Habibie itself had just assessed that no matter what happened, eventually the East Timorese would choose to go independent. So why bother postponing the day with violence and cost in the meantime? I'm not sure that the pressure from America was really particularly important. So I just want to have a note here on the. You can see the campaigns themselves, the demands are fairly clear. What actually happened is fairly clear. But it's interesting to note what kind of political debates that took place. I'm not aware actually amongst the forces involved in the 1942-46 campaigns what sort of internal debates amongst the different parts of the Solidarity movement there were. Although in Rupert Lockwood's book he does mention how the CPA was critical of the Indonesian communists for being a bit ultra-left. But I'd be surprised if there weren't debates about strategy and tactics within, the Labour students and the CPA, trade unions and the church groups and so on. A researcher needs to look into that. The main debate in Vietnam was in the Vietnam movement. Was between those who supported the out now demand and those who called for negotiations. In the Timor-Leste one, certainly from my experience, the main tension was over how to relate to the Labour Party. And one of the events where this was concentrated was when some of us, Asiet, which also the DSP, Frethelin and Mary MacKillop Catholic Sisters, called for a national day of action on the day that the Labour government recognised East Timor as a province of Indonesia. Australia was the only country in the world to recognise East Timor as a province of Indonesia. In the United Nations, East Timor was considered a country, or a country where the decolonisation process had not taken place or finished. But Australia was the only country that actually, maybe there's one other small country somewhere, Switzerland or somewhere, I forget. But Australia was the only country sort of involved that recognised that. And we said, well, let's have a national day of action on that day. But we met resistance from a lot of the Timorese solidarity activists who had some kind of link with East Timor. We also had a debate with the Labour Party members of Parliament should speak at a rally when they were known for speaking against the demands of the rally. So there was always a sentiment that we should try and win over the Labour Party somehow But that was, I think, in the end, in terms of numbers, a minority sentiment. So I'm just going to end up with a couple of slides relating to the situation today. I think, we have a continuation, a worsening, if you like, of the situation that the Timorese movement. We have now most of the leadership of the Parliamentary Labour Party doing all they can to avoid serious support for a free Palestine. Although we do have emerging but still weak, we have even one or two Labour Party members, and now you have trade unions, unionists for Palestine, rank and file groups. But even in a recent mass meeting in the Trades Hall here in Melbourne, as far as I've heard the reports, there was also a sort of tension between the members on the floor and the leaders over how strong the position should be on Palestine. So it's quite a strong contrast that way with a weaker objective situation. There's some unfortunately favourable conditions. The actual brutality of Zionist Israel itself, and the extent to which anyone who accesses the news on their mobile phone or internet can see almost on not a daily basis, hourly basis if you're following it, or if you're watching cable TV like Al Jazeera, it's just a constant exposure of the brutality, which of course has helped reverse the pro-Israeli sentiment that was very strong and certainly overwhelmingly strong when I was being brought up. And I think despite all the demobilisation that's happened over the last 40 years, through various mechanisms, there's a very strong democratic humanist sentiment that still has survived in Australian society, which was revealed with the huge numbers on the Sydney Harbour Bridge recently, but also in previous ones, the 1 million people around Australia against the Iraq War and so on. It's a sentiment that's there, but it's not organised, not connected to a political perspective, and therefore it's difficult to get it to have the maximum optimal political impact. It obviously does have a political impact. Albanese's shift on Palestine, his rhetorical shift, which is now tripling themselves up over, is obviously in reaction to that pressure. But I think it's difficult to imagine how that can, not difficult to imagine, but we have to think seriously about how that movement can become stronger. There's some similarities and some similarities with past movements. As with Timor, the Palestinian Arab diaspora has played a very important role here. The organised far left, although my old party, the DSP, is gone, and Red Spark is still very small. Socialist Alternative, which has provided important activist resources in some cities, but at least in my opinion, not a strong political perspective. There's still no national coordination or sense, although the August 24 national-wide event, if that becomes more regular, might provide that kind of perspective. And the Sydney Harbour Bridge mobilisation also indicates that the potential for popular support for this being strengthened and growing. And today, just final one, not so much, this is sort of more of what the Palestinian solidarity movement here faces in terms of the ruling class's position. The pressure that's accumulated since 2023 is basically since the beginning of this year, and the fact that the Israeli government is not helping the Australian ruling class, because the Australian ruling class has relied on being able to say, yes, we have to support Israel and we'll acknowledge Palestine sometime in the future because we're for a two-state solution. So let's be patient, blah, 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 blah. But of course, the overt continual statements by the Zionists in Israel that, no, we actually want one state, Greater Israel, is just tearing that fig leaf away. So making it harder and harder for the Australian ruling class, and in this case the Australian Labor government, to keep up that. They say, we want two-state solution, but everyone can see Israel does not. So but they still want to support Israel somehow anyway. So they're revealed this, the fig leaf is gone, and the question, they are more exposed to the question of, do you actually agree with Israeli occupation or not? Now they shifted their rhetoric, then they shifted their rhetoric again. That wasn't enough. Then they've had to shift their rhetoric a further step to say, we will recognise Palestinian statehood in the General Assembly in September, but of course we have conditions. Now, all of the left Palestinian groups, Palestinian People's Party, the Democratic Front for Liberation of Palestine, and the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, all say, yes, this is the more countries that recognise Palestinian statehood, the better, it's significant, but it's not going to solve the situation on the ground, it's not enough, and so on. And as you've been following the news the last 1 or 2 days, you'll see that Mr. Netanyahu is really expressing overt, quite, very angry statements against Albanese. And I think, if I was the Zionist in Israel, I would also be very worried. I would not be worried that the recognition of statehood, it's in and of itself, will amount to very much. But I would be very worried that it sets a precedent of making concessions to public pressure. That's a worrying trend. What's the next concession? If public pressure continues to grow, what's the next concession? If public pressure continues to grow, what's the concession after that? So I think the Israeli hostile action to what Albanese said, apart from being, in opposition to their propaganda, has a basis in that as popular support for Palestine grows around the world, capitalist governments in capitalist countries making concessions to public opinion, even if initially rhetorical and with conditions that make them meaningless, can be the first step in further concessions to come. And finally, I think in particular in the case of Palestine, I think the momentum is with the Sydney Harbour region, and now the call for national action. The momentum, the potential for growing momentum is there. We cannot water down any of the demands that the movement is bringing forward and the Palestinians themselves are arguing for. But I think in Australia we need, amongst everyone who's concerned about this, a deeper familiarity with the situation on the ground in Palestine, including politically. Red Spark ourselves, we're a small group, so we have not huge resources, but at least on our website, we've started publishing the statements and responses of the different progressive Palestinian groups. And maybe we have to do that more and go a bit broader so people can see, well, what's the different groups in Palestinians thinking. I think a very important statement to read is a statement signed by 14 of all of the main Palestinian political groups in a meeting that was held in Beijing a few months ago to get a feel for when they have to sit down and come to a joint statement, what their outlook is and the points that they emphasise. I think we have to become more familiar with all that, because what's going to happen now is that the more concessions capitalist government makes to pressure, the more they'll also try to think of ways to sow confusion amongst the community. So the only medicine to confusion is clarity, And it's up to, I think, the left in particular to provide that clarity. But you can't provide clarity by just crapping on what you think at the spirit of the moment. You can only provide clarity by reading and studying, in particular, what's the Palestinian groups on the ground are saying. So I'd like to end there, and thank you very much for being patient.
Thank you, Max. So yeah, we're gonna, for anyone who wasn't here at the start, we have about 40 minutes for discussion. So if there were any questions that people had or points of clarity on, you know, what Max described on the history of Australian activist support for international liberation movements, and then also more specifically like the Palestinian movement today, what kind of slogans should we be using? What kinds of forces are involved in the movement today? Where can it go? Yeah, if you want to indicate, and then we will probably take a couple of contributions at one time and then come back to Max.
Can I just raise before I ask a question now? Can we use the microphone? Is it, can we hand over the microphone to the...
Yeah, sure. Would you be able to like facilitate that?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Thanks very much for that, Max. That was excellent overall, a good overview for many of the movements which I've lived through myself. Can I just take you up on a small point, and you say that there was no national organisation for the Timorese cause. I was involved in the Timorese cause from the late 70s when I was involved in the radio link to Fretilin up in Darwin that was under the campaign for the independent East Timor. Then I went to university in Perth and I was involved in Friends of East Timor, and then later on I moved to Melbourne and I was involved in AETA here, Australia East Timor Association. Even though there were different groups, we did have national communication. We did visit each other regularly, we exchanged things, we had a few conferences too. I remember there was quite a big one in Adelaide in 1982. And then there were the publications. There was Janice Freeney's one, East Timor News, and John Waddingham's one, East Timor Newsletter. And even though the groups were small, they did create a very important framework. That information did get out, and the information from the radio link, for example, got out and went overseas, and that created preconditions for later mobilisations internationally. So even though we were small groups, we did have some national coordinations. And I actually think, I'm a bit immodest, but I think we were quite important in creating the basis of what then changed when it became bigger again in the 90s. I'm just wondering. Anyway, that's my perspective.
Yep. It would actually be really great if people could say their names and like if you're from an organisation or a group or anything like that.
Yeah. I'm Peter Job. I'm an academic in international political studies, but I was also very much involved in the Timor campaign, and I've recently written about Palestine as well.
Thank you.
All right, so my name is Arham. I'm from Indonesia, and first of all, I'd like to share a little bit of my experience studying in Australian university, at University of Melbourne, in regards with which also aligns with what we discussed tonight. So in a class where we talk about policy studies or policy development, there's a guest lecturer coming and talk about what's the development of sort of inclusive development policy in Australia. And she mentioned about in around 1960s, 1970s, there wasn't any sufficient social security services for old people by then. And I was asking in the class, right, like during that time, there was a sort of military aggression from Australia in Kalimantan or Borneo in Indonesia. I was just asking whether there is a correlation within them, whether Australia concentrated their money to fund the military forces there. The response I got was a bit sort of like, I think it's a sort of apolitical thing. She said that she thinks every country has their national interest, and I think talking about national interest in policy development kind of studies is a little bit less relevant to her. And in another class, this professor told me that in public policy, social policy studies, or schools in University of Melbourne, most of them are from these Oxford, Cambridge kind of scholars. And they are all, most of them are more neoclassical kind of schools, who are a little bit reluctant in talking about politics when they are delivering their course in the class. And the last one, I had also a class where this professor was really great when talking about environmental studies, talking about capitalism, neoliberalism, and how these sort of systems has been entangled in every environmental cases. And in his publications was extensive in environmental justices as well. But in fact, I found that he didn't, while he was talking a lot about like a war and how carbon emission is related to war and everything, where, but he didn't really talk. He had a huge, extensive space to talk about Palestine in there, but he didn't really do it. And from a sort of trusted resource, I found that this professor didn't really engage in a pro-Palestinian kind of movement as well. This experience really, to me, sort of reflections or sort of lesson to me that in university today, there was a huge or deliberate reluctance in talking about politics. And most of the people using this sort of bureaucratic kind of approach when talking about policy, for example, when it is really deeply political, right? So, and then I think it's sort of, this is also, I want to hear a comment from Max. There's sort of hegemonic kind of structure within the university that doesn't allow really people to talk about Palestine, for example, especially the scholars. And I also want to emphasize this prevail kind of sort of beliefs among the scholars. This is what we call intersectionality, where people talk about different kind of things, feminism, talk about environmentalism, talk about including pro-Palestine, for example. It's also mentioned in Mac's presentations. There is this fragmentation among activism. So there's basically nothing that conjoins all these intersectionality kind of studies. Every sector or every sector just struggles or talks about their own things, and it also shows how in university. I mean, these professors are economically good, right? So talking about Palestine might threaten their careers or something like that. So basically, these sort of structural, institutional constraints in universities really doesn't allow us to speak about political things, including but not limited, well, especially actually about Palestine. Thanks.
I'll just hand back to Max before coming to the other hands in the room.
Yeah. No, I thought in my talk I sort of made that clear that all the 1970 groups did speak to each other. I think I even mentioned they had national conference. In the 90s they had a couple of national conferences also, which I attended, including one in Darwin. But the point is that there was nothing like the Victorian Vietnam moratorium campaign. There's no overarching organisation that could call national protests. The East Timor, the national protests every year, there were national protests once a year on on the anniversary of the Dili massacre. But other than that, it was relatively fragmented. I'm making the comparison with Vietnam, but of course the Vietnam one was also short-lived, from 1970 to 1975, something like that. So that's on whether those pre-existing groups coordinated with communicated with each other. Definitely the case, but as you said, they each produced their own publications, so there's no national East Timor publication either. On Arhan's point, there's so many points there, I couldn't answer all of them in a short time, but maybe the starting point could be the death of the left on Australian university campuses. I mean, I hate to do this. I find myself doing this too much these days, saying back in the day. But when I went to university in 1969, 1972, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that on the door of almost every single lecturer, there would be a political poster, left or right, or some kind. Now you walk around the university and there's not a political poster on anybody's door, and probably it's forbidden anyway. Because it'll scratch the door or something like that. But I think this is a result of the same erosion of progressive social democratic institutions that's taken place since 1983. I mean, it's the change from having 70 to 80% of workers active in unions to 10% and 6% in the private sector is an enormous change. It's in slogans calling for unions campaign this, unions campaign that. In a sense, they miss the point. The real slogan should be rebuild the unions so you can campaign, because even the CFMEU, which has been, as everyone knows, taken over by the government, the other unions there's no union movement to defend it. To go from 70% to 10% and 6% in the private sectors, it's a huge change. But that's reflected with the liberal aid organisations, with the left wing of the Labor Party, everything. So it's not surprising that in that situation, it's reflected on the campuses. So in my mind, for the young people who have to take up these struggles, you have to combine two things at once. You have to rebuild while at the same time going on the offensive. You can't wait to rebuild to go on the offensive, because then everything will be fucked up and too late. So you have to find ways to rebuild while going on the offensive. And I think the fragmentation question, I don't think finding some vehicle through intersectional theory will lead us anywhere, but it's a reflection of the weakness of left-wing parties. It's left-wing parties that bring together issues, because they they'll have if they're a Marxist party, they'll have a theory through which you can see things and find ways for all of the different arenas of oppression to have responses. So there also it's a rebuilding. You can't expect significant change to happen if there's no serious left-wing party, socialist party. And of course now the problem is because of the 20 years of no such left-wing party, that one that's Marxist, socialist, and also internationalist, you almost have to start from scratch, and that scares people, or that's going to be too hard. But I think living in a society where everything degrades because there is no left-wing party is going to end up being even harder for people to live through. Next two.
Okay. Could people just do a show of hands so I can get an idea of how many wanted? Did you still want to contribute? Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just saying, did you still want to? And you're on the list. Okay, nice. Okay, so yeah, do you want to go? If people could keep the contributions to like 2 or 3 minutes, so we have enough time to get everybody.
Thank you, Max. I'm Julia. I've been a political activist, I guess, in Palestine solidarity work for at least 15 years, and I'm a member of Red Spark as well. I really appreciate some of that historical context of thinking about how in Australia there were social movements that managed to push foreign policy, put pressure on foreign policy, and I think it's so useful for our time, because the type of pressure that we need to put on the political parties today when it comes to Palestine is huge. I'm curious as to, I know that the Palestinian movements often refer to the anti-apartheid movement. I'm curious as to why you didn't select that, although I think the Palestinian solidarity movements would learn a lot from this historical context that you've put forward here today. I'm curious as to what you think of that international solidarity movement and perhaps why you didn't include it. I know you had to be selective. Thank you.
I guess I just wanted to get your opinion on the Vietnam War. I know there was a lot of anti-war movement coming in from within the military as well. And I guess the impact of the fact that we actually had troops on the ground there, and the personal effect of so many Australians of having family members or being forced to go, or, you know, I also listened to a lot of things about police officers who are forced to arrest people. And I guess, yeah, us living in a very capitalist society where everyone is very selfish, but they're not able to actually take action. Like, they can say, oh, that's really horrible that it's happening. But I wonder if that's why Vietnam had so much success, is because people were actually personally affected. And then also, I guess around the same frame, like Gough Whitlam being sacked as well, who had like a lot of socialist views and policies, and had appointed a very socialist member, and then the whole government being overthrown by the Attorney General. I guess making more fear in the Labor Party now to, you know, go with America or whatever. And then also, just one more quick thing, there is also a plan of action, a national plan of action to put Labor members on notice. So I don't know if anyone's heard about that. I think it's on a lot of the social media accounts, but if you need to connect with people, you can reach out. And it's trying to be organised nationally with all different Labor members' offices being occupied.
Do you want to say a bit more about that, actually, in case people haven't heard of it?
Yeah, it's basically they're putting a call out to everyone to organise among their electorate with people that they know and trust. It's like spread over 3 days. There are posts on the webpage. If you're, on a lot of Instagrams. I'm trying to think of one that's done it. I think Stop Arming Israel may have. I'm not affiliated with any group. I'm just, I'm part of some chats where you can see people organising all over Australia. So if you're at all interested, you can talk to me. I can see where your electorate is and see if I can connect you.
So just for Max then, that was a question about the parallels between the Palestine solidarity movement and the anti-apartheid movement, and then the significance that you think of the personal effects of people being impacted in Vietnam, and then this national plan of action around protesting Labour.
Not including apartheid was clearly wrong, and it's no doubt because my head is oriented towards Asia. I think a lot of similar points would be revealed if, it would be there too if you looked at the forces involved and the forces involved in the way it was organised, the use of the boycott and sanction strategy and so on. I think there would be a lot to learn if I'd included that. But it's just my head where it's maybe too oriented towards the region. Was there another element to your question? I forget.
What else did I ask? I
think that's what I got as the basis.
Yeah,
Yeah, that was
yeah.
the main
Yeah.
question. I just thought it was useful. to
Yeah,
have
no, I
this
think it's a
historical
good,
context, and the Palestine solidarity movement
it's
would
a,
benefit from some of this historical context as well.
it would indeed. Conscription, some people do argue that the sentiment against the Vietnam War was, more, a big portion of it or a significant portion of it was against conscription rather than what was happening in Vietnam. But I don't think that's completely true, because if you go back and look at footage of conscientious objectors or Save Our Sons or Youth Against Conscription and so on, all of the rationale is, no one sort of said they were against conscription, or very few, only, like conscientious objectors from a religious background would say, I'm against conscription on principle. They would say, I'm against conscription to fight in an unjust war. And every time they said that, then that reinforces the conclusion, reinforces the opinion that it is an unjust war. You can't go and take over somebody else's country because you don't like their politics. I think that was, and you can still see on social media today, because I remember myself back then, one of the most common things you saw on TV those days was Muhammad Ali about statement about why he refused. He chose to go to jail rather than be sent to Vietnam, and it was he didn't want to go over and kill poor brown people who'd done nothing to him. So I think those two issues could never be totally separated.
Yeah, I think I meant more in terms of mobilising, not necessarily
No,
their overall sentiment, but just like people being called to act. Because
I think people called out, they mobilised also because of the sentiment they felt. 200,000. No, I don't think that's explained by the selfish side. No, I agree, capitalism strengthens the selfish side of people's personality, but I don't think it was that side that was mobilising the numbers then. On the ALP thing, it's very interesting. I mean, I suppose it's always been like this, but in the current situation, it's sort of more like this than it usually is. In that we can't expect. I don't think we can expect any significant progressive decisions in relation to Palestine or anything else with the current parliament. So anything that starts to raise the message, we need a totally new parliament, a totally new set of representatives, totally new. Maybe there's one or two or three that anything that starts to develop that consciousness is needed. Not that I'm sort of a parliamentarist, everything will be solved by having a better parliament, because you will not ever have a progressive representative body in Australia unless there's a strong, big progressive movement, organised progressive movement. There's never going to be a progressive majority in a national representative body like a parliament unless a majority of ordinary people are active in progressive politics. So you can't bypass building a movement, and you can't bypass building organisations that play a role in building a movement. But the idea that you need a fucking whole new parliament is an idea that people need to think about, even though it might seem impossible. If it doesn't happen, then what? Okay, in a revolutionary situation, all of the current institutions are abolished and thrown away. But I think one way to start people thinking that is that they're all hopeless. All of them are hopeless. So if that's the conclusion, then what do you do? Have to have somebody else from us
Yeah, to add on to that, I think that like someone was commenting, like the ALP are a rotten racist party because they're representatives of a rotten racist system. But I think that this kind of mobilization, like targeting and exposing the ALP for what they are and what they're representatives of, is a great move forward to have that kind of targeting, and especially like hearing about the lessons that can be learned from previous solidarity campaigns to try and have that kind of national coordination and targeting to bring forces together, to also make it a broad movement encompassing a lot of different actors and groups to like build that strength and cohesion. I think that sounds like a great step forward at achieving that and moving forward for Palestine. Solidarity with Palestine, as well as exposing the ALP as being representatives of this like barbaric system that they uphold. So I had you next, and then was there anyone else who wanted to indicate? Great. I think those will probably have to be the last ones, and so we'll take these three and then come back.
Kieran, I'm a member of the Anarchist Communist Federation. Max, you mentioned that recent meeting at Trades Hall, and I was there, and I thought I'd comment on it briefly because I think it's instructive. We had on a platform what passes, I think, for the left in the ALP. We had an AMWU Assistant Secretary, Tony Piccolo, who's genuine about Palestine, and I think as far as bureaucrats in Australia go, you could describe as left. You know, we had a VTHC Assistant Secretary, an ALP left activist, and a random rank and file speaker. But what struck me about it is the meeting opened with Tony Piccolo offering excuses at length about why they've been unable to organise effectively around Palestine. He didn't say this explicitly, but we have to take our members along with us. Our members are not here on this. We only have one member in the relevant workplace. We can't make decisions in this way, so on and so forth. Tony, I believe, is genuine about Palestine, but it's instructive. But the VTHC Assistant Secretary, like you mentioned, there's some conflict with the audience that developed. Will Struck essentially lectured the assembled people for their impudence around demanding more action on Palestine. So this was instructive, but the audience was also instructive, I think, because people who'd come front, like there was this tension walking in the door. There's this frustration with formal union leadership and demands that more be done. But when they got the floor, people on the floor didn't know what to ask for, didn't know the demands to raise. There were expressions of frustration. The leadership is not coming, you're not backing us, you're right-wing on Palestine, whatever, you're failing to call the general strike now, why haven't the AMW and the MUA implemented sanctions on Israel? But when the question's put to them, well, what explicit, like Will and Tony are both good operators in this, well, what explicitly do you expect me personally to do? And people didn't know how to respond to that, and were politically flat-footed in response. This rally on the 24th of August is coming up, and it's been unanimously endorsed by trade union secretaries in Victoria. And all trade union secretaries are sending an email to tell members to go to a contingent at 11 a.m. at Trades Hall, and doing no other effective organising for it. There'll be some social media posts and otherwise. And a union secretary over beers told me that this was the test. Where we fine, you've got your union rally. If no one turns out from it, then there's not much else we're going to be able to do on this Palestine issue, Kieran. So an interesting juncture that we find ourselves in, and worth reflecting on.
Yeah, thanks, Kieran. I'm Sam. I'm a member of Red Spark. This action on the 24th, this Sunday, is, I guess it's more important than some of the other Sunday actions because it's come out of a national call, which, it came out of a call which was made after the Sydney Harbour Bridge March as well, as a national day of action. And, I guess in effect it's organised by the committees in each city, as have the previous actions, but it seems to be a step towards attempting to establish a national framework and a more national coordinated campaign. So I think that's an important step, or an important attempt at least, and something that we should all support, obviously. One of the last things that Max said is, in making concessions that the ALP government will try to sow as much confusion as possible in doing so, and I think that's obviously the case. I mean, they'll try that anytime, obviously, whether making concessions or not, because they don't support the Palestine Solidarity Campaign's demands. I think a couple of key ways that they do it. I mean, one, you could see this interview, for example, with Penny Wong, taken immediately after the Harbour Bridge action, and she made the obviously hypocritical comment that, this expresses the sentiment that we all have, even though obviously, she and other members of the government have been working against that sentiment and against the demands of the movement. So they're going to try to pretend, I guess, that any concessions, whether rhetorical or more concrete, they do make are things that they'd wanted to do, or are not a result of pressure, not a result of the movement or the international, the pressure of the international movement and situation. That's one thing. But I think very likely a key thing that the Labor Party will keep doing, and they have done, is basically just saying, well, there's nothing we can really do. Peter and I were talking about this before the meeting started. That's what the ruling class did in relation to East Timor. You had editorials in the Australian newspaper right up until, weeks before, or days before probably, Australia actually did take action to send a peacekeeping force, that the editorial was saying that this is just the awful truth is that there's nothing can be done. And that's clearly Albanese's line. They say, we're just, it's the other side of the world, we have no effect, and they try to cover up as much as possible. And I think this is perhaps one of the key roles of the movement, is to make as concrete as possible all the actual ties that they do have. Make it more concrete. I mean, we can say some of the figures, like what is it, Australia invests, trying to remember now, 900 billion in just over 900, getting the figure wrong. Anyway, we can, in the, of the Australian state-controlled fund, investing in Israel, they have the defence ties, they have the diplomatic ties, other economic ties as well. I think that is important. Obviously, breaking Australian ties with Israel alone will not be decisive. There has to be the decisive action has to come from the United States, which, the Israeli genocide can't continue to operate without the support of the United States. But any and all actions that come from basically other imperialist countries like Australia or any of the others that start to lessen or, would have a massive international impact and increase the pressure on the United States government, or have an impact on the political situation there. But I think trying to make concrete in everybody's mind, what are the ties exactly, and what are all the aspects of them, and the different workplaces that are involved in doing joint production or sending military goods or other goods, and these sorts of things. Maybe that's a way to try to make it harder for them to throw up that smoke.
Thank you. And also the political cover that they give to Israel's genocide in terms of all the statements made about Israel's right to defend itself, the condemnations of the Palestinian resistance. We can't forget those statements that they've made if they do try roll back on things. I had a last contributor here. Yeah. If you were able to do a couple of minutes.
Yes, thank you. Terima kasih, Max. Thank you very much. Good to see you again. My name is Bella Kusuma. I work for SBS in 1989 until 2008, so I really familiar with your involvement with East Timorese activists. I'd like to, you mentioned about the Santa Cruz. That point is the turning point of international support for, or sympathy toward East Timorese. And I think the cameraman who shot that in Santa Cruz is Max Stoll, isn't it correct? Yeah. And then send it to Darwin, and then from Darwin to England, and saw it on television, Channel 5. And Suharto was in Zimbabwe, attended the Non-Alignment Movement Conference Summit in Zimbabwe. And his entourage watched that footage, and he was very, very upset. Returning to Indonesia, Suharto summoned General Trisutrisno. And after that, Suharto was very disappointed with Trisutrisno. What I'm saying is, you also involved very close with that movement in Santa Cruz. And would you elaborate, explain why the reason the Santa Cruz happened? And that's. Secondly, you resided in Yogyakarta. I saw you on Facebook discussion, and also you have associated with PRD, People Democratic Party, which is, they're very, very brave, and PRD is the main target for Indonesian military in any demonstration, and the intel chase them. Are you disappointed today with what happened in Indonesian politics, where all PRD leaders become collaborated or cooptation with the political party in Indonesia? Thank you very much.
Max, you have a few minutes to try and come back on as many of those points as you
Okay,
can.
yeah.
And if you want to do any kind of like concluding statements as
I'll do
well.
that as well. Thanks for the report back, Kieran. That basically is what I'd heard from our comrades as well. And I think the way you described the audience is, for me, very significant, because if you read the different analysis we have up on Red Spark website, one thing that sort of hammer away at is that over the last 20 or 30 years, you have this what I call democratic humanist sentiment that's solid there amongst a significant percentage of the population, reflected in the mass mobilizations that have taken around a whole bunch of issues over the last 30 or 40 years. But this sentiment has become detached from organization, from ideology, and even from tradition. People, 200 or 300,000 people, whatever it was on Sydney Harbour Bridge, or the huge crowd that greeted Nelson Mandela, or the Reconciliation March, or there's lots of examples that there's I don't know if it's a majority or a minority or what percentage, but there's a significant number of people whose sentiment is aroused by these obvious cases of injustice and violence. But like you say, when they're asked political questions, they can't answer, because the rupture is so great. It's not just rupture that they don't have an organisation anymore. With the disappearance of the organisations over 30 or 40 years, they don't have an ideological sense. Of course, everybody has an ideology somewhere in their brain, some perspective, but in terms of an identifiable ideological outlook, they don't have. And actually, I think the rupture is also even with tradition. that that's in some unions the tradition of militant struggle is still there, but it's very, very narrow. Very small these days. And then you get situation of political vacuum like that. You get the kind of speeches you heard from the stage, where the bureaucrat will also say something that sort of reflects the same psychology. I don't know what to do either. So that's one comment there. I think on the Sam's thing, I think we should also remember, maybe I should have emphasised this more in the talk on Vietnam, but the troops out, the out now slogan was not just vis-a-vis Australian troops. Everyone was also demanding US troops get out of Vietnam. And I think that has to enter into the Palestinian set of demands as well. Australia cut military ties with Israel, US cut military ties with it. That has to be part of the explicit demands made. Australian government tell the US they have to cut ties. They won't do that, of course, but we need to raise that demand until the pressure is great. And so, in conclusion, I think the two areas that Sam are correct. I think but I think they will also try to sow confusion about the political situation in Palestine itself. It's already started. Divide and rule. Hamas is bad. Palestinian Authority is good. When the Palestinian Authority, you watch. When the Palestinian Authority can't eliminate Hamas, then they look. It's a mess. There's no solution. So unless we are able to have an argument as to what's happening on the ground politically, at least provide the context as to why that's difficult, why these complications are there, they'll be able to do that divide and rule, sowing confusion also. Why the Dili massacre? Why precisely that happened? Whether it was just was obviously the attitude of the Indonesian military, and it's quite interesting that it wasn't a different attitude amongst Indonesian civil servants and so on, but the attitude amongst the Indonesian military was that, despite the official propaganda line, that Timorese were, the whole of the Timorese people were enemies. They were occupying a foreign, occupying a territory where all of the population were enemies. You do that for 1 or 2 years, okay, 5 years, 10 years. By 1990, it's 15 years like that. So for 15 years, soldiers think the whole of the Timorese people are enemies. So in a tense situation, who gave the orders, shoot, fire? Maybe Peter knows more about that than me, but I don't think, I think the underpinning thing was, and the same happened later, the officers who served in Timor were later sent to Aceh. And the attitude was the same. The Achenese people, all of them are the enemy. So you get that situation. PRD, well, you have to remember, first that the People's Democratic Party, which spearheaded the popular movement against Suharto, was formed really 1994, so it only lasted 4 or 5 years. Everyone except one person was under the age of 22 or 23. What they achieved was just incredible in that 4 or 5 years. And certainly that party has disintegrated over the 10 years after Suharto. Some have joined the ratbag, rat shit bourgeois parties. Some have just gone into private life, become academics, but there's still a significant portion. If you go to any progressive trade union in Indonesia today, the founders are PRD, and you'll still find PRD people in their 50s and 60s still active at the grassroots level, especially in trade unions and women's organisations. So it doesn't surprise me. I was disappointing that it broke up, but it doesn't surprise me. It was a party that had existed only for 4 or 5 years, comprising people with no political experience, young people, and really almost no life experience in the 19, 20, 21 years old. What they achieved was amazing. And it's still the case that most of the progressive trade union and women's liberation organisations were started by ex-PRD and you still find ex-PRD people there. So,
sorry, I think you'll have to continue the discussion after the meeting just because we have to be out of the room.
That's a longer answer. So I'd just like to end up, if I can make a final comment. I hope people have found this interesting, but something more interesting still is coming up. On October 4, please note this down in your diaries or your memory, on October 4, Red Spark is organising a dinner which will be held at the Brunswick Neighbourhood Centre. Be live music, full Indonesian meal and so on. But we'll have two very interesting speakers, face-to-face, not on Zoom, at the meeting. One is Shamik Badra, who is the Australian representative of the Palestine People's Party, one of the three parties in the Progressive Caucus in Palestine. And we'll also be having Avelino Duquelo, the president of the Socialist Party of Timor, speak. And we will also have a 10 or 15-minute video presentation by one of the left-wing progressive trade unions in Indonesia. So Indonesia will be there, Timor will be there, and the main speaker, so to speak, will be Shamik Badra from the Palestine People's Party. We really want to make this meeting a success because one of the kind of activities that was part of all the past solidarity amendments was hearing directly from people from the region itself, different colours, different variations, different emphasis, different ideological streams and so on, hearing them directly, raising money. Profits from the dinner will go to food and water project for youth, children in Gaza. So we really want to make a success of that, and we hope all of you will come. You can also book a table, so if you want to bring friends, you can do that. You go to Red Spark website, click events, and you'll find the details for the dinner. October 4, it's a Saturday, 6 p.m. So we hope as many of you can get to that as well.
Thank you. And just before we finish, thank you again, Max. I just wanted to say that, this was the first in our 4-part lecture series, anti-imperialist seminar series. I think one thing that I took away most from Max's presentation was this need to re-establish a revolutionary party in Australia so that all these different struggles that we see can be understood and fought against within a framework. And that's certainly what we're trying to do at Red Spark. So if you also want to do that, do talk to us about getting involved. But also I just wanted to reaffirm that our next lecture in the seminar series is going to be on Cuba and Venezuela, because as much as we want to examine the fundamental contradictions of capitalism, which we're going to do in subsequent sessions, we also want to demonstrate why socialism is the only alternative to that, and to really understand what socialism means in practice. So the next session on Cuba and Venezuela is going to look at how, since their revolutions, for Cuba in 1959 and Venezuela in 1999, they've both stood as examples to the rest of the world, to oppressed countries all over the world, that it is possible to fight imperialism, it's possible to win, and also that doing so is the first step towards building socialism as the antidote to that terror and poverty and destruction and war that we've touched on. And for that, Western imperialist countries led by the US have sought to punish and destroy socialist Cuba and Venezuela's Bolivarian revolutions with economic sabotages, coups, military invasions, assassination attempts, to name a few. But those countries, socialism in Cuba and the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, are surviving whilst under this constant attack. And amidst this global capitalist crisis. So in the meeting, we're going to discuss the challenges that those countries are facing, the kind of internal contradictions, to try and understand them more, and what kind of lessons we can learn from them, and what kind of international solidarity we can extend to them. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Do talk to us about what's coming up next, and thank you again to Max for that brilliant presentation.